Let's go now to Sydney, Australia, where Antony Loewenstein, an independent journalist and the author of My Israel Question, joins us now. Good to have you back with us, Antony. Quite a remarkable turn of events in the last few hours. In Israel launching a number of attacks, including on the capital, Tehran. This was foreshadowed somewhat by the US President Donald Trump, who on Thursday said that he was drawing down non-essential US personnel from its missions in the Middle East. Tell us, what's your initial reaction to what we're seeing now? Are you worried that this might turn into a larger scale conflict between Israel and Iran?
I'm certainly worried. I think anyone who's not doesn't know, particularly the current Israeli regime. But this is really something that Netanyahu himself has wanted for literally decades. He's been talking since the 1990s about the fact that Iran apparently is 5 minutes away from building a nuclear bomb. And every time he said it, he's been wrong. He's been saying it for literally 30, 40 years. And that's often then echoed by his supporters in the West. You know, I think about in 2002, Netanyahu was talking to the US Congress about how a US-led invasion of Iraq would somehow liberate the region. And we saw what happened to Iraq, 20 years of complete chaos and carnage. So here we are in 2025, and Israel in the last 20 months has obviously committed genocide in Gaza, but the war has gone far beyond that. We're talking about attacking Syria and Lebanon and Yemen and now Iran. And the question really is, what is the ultimate goal here? Is the goal to unseat the regime change, which is certainly ambitious. It's clearly illegal to do so. This is an unprovoked attack. It's illegitimate. And it's also questionable whether it's going to be successful. This idea that the US was not involved, to me, is delusional. The US may not have worked alongside the Israelis, although we don't know that for sure, but they undeniably would have given it at least the green light. I just cannot conceive of the Trump administration vehemently opposing it and Israel going against them. So this was, to me, a US-Israeli-led strike. And when Iran almost inevitably strikes back, as happened last year against Israeli targets, there were Arab states and the Americans and the Europeans who assisted Israel to make those strikes less serious. So we are entering, frankly, uncharted territory, and everyone should be concerned, yes.
Antony, we know that the Israeli strike comes less than a day after the UN's nuclear watchdog, the IAEA, announced that for the first time in 20 years, it found that Iran was in breach of its non-proliferation obligations. It said it was concerned about the fact that Iran was no longer fully cooperating with UN inspectors. It also expressed concerns about the presence of nuclear materials at a number of sites across Iran, and that it was conducting secretive activities. This motion, though, wasn't unanimous. 19 out of the 35 countries on the board of the IAEA backed this motion, which we understand was being supported by the US, UK, France and Germany. To what extent was that motion from the IAEA being used as perhaps a pretext or cover by the Israelis to launch this strike in the last few hours?
I see it as certainly a cover. In fact, I think the Defense Minister, Israel Katz, explained and explicitly mentioned that what you're talking about there, Oscar. I think the bigger picture here, though, is the fact that Israel has vehemently opposed any kind of rapprochement between the US and Iran and have been vehemently opposed to these ongoing talks between the Trump administration and Iran. The next round was supposed to happen this weekend. Hard to see that happening, frankly, considering what's happening. I mean, ultimately, to me, it's really unclear in a way what the Israeli goal is. Now, one would argue, is it not regime change? Is it not defanging the regime? I would say in some ways that the Iranian regime has helped the Israelis for years, that it's been the big bad boy in the region. That's according to the Israeli and American telling of it. To maintain a regime like that in power has served, in my view, Israeli goals for years, frankly, decades. I think the bigger picture here is also the question of Netanyahu is facing political troubles at home. A lot of people in Israel, and I share this view, rightly think that the war and genocide in Gaza is being continued now for no real purpose. They're literally bombing rubble day after day after day to keep Netanyahu in power. And whatever justification or reason Netanyahu will give, and he released a 8-minute video a few hours ago, which I watched just before, and he's talking about how this strike on Iran is akin to trying to stop the Nazis back in the 1930s and 40s. And if only our ancestors, he's talking about Jewish ancestors, would have stopped the Nazis, then the Holocaust wouldn't have happened. I mean, those kind of comparisons are frankly absurd and offensive. And I say this as someone Jewish who lost family in the Holocaust. Look, the Iranian regime is repressive, they're authoritarian, there are many Iranian citizens who loathe the regime. There's no question about that. That's been clear for years. That's becoming clearer by the day. However, none of that justifies an unprovoked military attack by Israel on Iran, which is killing, yes, maybe some military figures, but also huge amounts of civilians. And the bottom line here is this, that all these military attacks by Israel in the last 20 months militarily has shown Israel as dominating. But one thing Israel is not getting, and in fact it's declining massively globally, is legitimacy. Public opinion in Europe, in the US, in Australia, vast parts of the world have never loathed Israel more. So they can have all the military prowess they want, and they can attack Iran and Syria and Lebanon and Gaza and the West Bank. To what end? A deluded belief that military power is enough to bring you safety and security, but actually, in my view, the opposite is true.
Antony, in the last few minutes, we've been receiving lines out of Israel from the Israeli military that it will impose a complete siege on the occupied West Bank, that it will lock down and impose a lockdown on Palestinian cities in the occupied West Bank until further notice, moving heavy military forces further into that occupied territory. What do you make of that development? What's the connection between this siege on the West Bank that they've announced and the strikes on Iran?
Very soon after October 7, when Israel started bombing indiscriminately in Gaza, what they did at the same time, which received far less attention globally, was hugely aggressively moving much more into the West Bank, kicking more Palestinians off territory and basically unofficially annexing. I mean, the West Bank is basically annexed, not officially, but essentially it has been. And I see this in a very similar way, where much of the world, understandably, is focused on what's happening in Iran, between Israel and Iran, the US. They're focusing on what's happening in Gaza, where I note in the last 24 hours, Israel has cut off most electricity internet connection. So not that much information is coming out of Gaza at the moment. This is a pretext for trying to continue a massive push into the West Bank. And it's worth saying on that the ultimate goal of people like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich and many in the Israeli right, and I would argue many in the Israeli mainstream in the West Bank, is similar to Gaza, either leveling the place or forcibly removing, kicking out, ethnically cleansing the Palestinians from the West Bank. This is the ultimate goal. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen tomorrow or next week, but in Gaza, the place no longer exists. And the ultimate goal there, as the Israeli government has made very clear, is to remove all Palestinians. And whether that's going to happen, of course, I don't know. And I very much oppose it, and any sane person would. The same goal for the Israelis is in the West Bank. That is what they want to achieve. And if there's a way to make life even more intolerable and miserable and ugly and brutal for Palestinians there, while the world is focused on Iran, then they will do so. And yet again, let me just say, where is the real international opposition to this? Where are the forces saying enough? No. Where is that coming from? The US certainly won't. The Europeans put out statements, useless. Frankly, much of the Arab elites either say nothing or frankly support what Israel is doing. That's the bottom line reality. And therefore, without, I would say, people power and other kind of forms of resistance, this situation is only going to get worse.
Antony, you mentioned earlier the number of fronts that Israel has opened up in the region, the ongoing war on Gaza, its siege of the occupied West Bank, conflicts in Yemen, Lebanon, Syria, and now this brazen strike on Iran. I'm interested to get your opinion on the Israeli public opinion? Because we know that many tens of thousands of Israelis have taken to the streets on a weekly basis since October the 7th, 2023, opposing this military action in Gaza, or at least calling on the government to do more to bring back hostages. But since it waged that war on Gaza, it has launched a number of strikes across these countries that I've mentioned. Surely the Israeli public isn't interested in yet more of its citizens being deployed in conflicts, and now a potential conflict with Iran.
One would like to think so. But as public opinion polls in Israel have shown, just including in the last month, there is a sizable proportion of people who want the war in Gaza to end and to get their hostages back, which of course inevitably involves negotiations with Hamas. However, there's also a position that virtually half the Israeli Jewish population supports some form of ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in Gaza. That's not my opinion. That's based on public opinion polls. Now, do the Israelis want to send their forces, ground troops into Lebanon, Syria, Iran? No. But the concept of greater Israel, this deluded belief that the more territory that you can hold under occupation brings you safety, ties into the belief, according to recent polls, that a majority of Israeli Jews think that holding on to the West Bank settlements, which of course are all illegal, gives them some kind of safety, security, or buffer zone against a perceived enemy. Of course, the opposite is true, that if you occupy people, as Israel has in Palestine for decades and decades, you will get resistance. It's cause and effect. It's a given. So whether Israelis, the majority of whom Israeli Jews, I mean, would support these attacks on Iran, it's obviously hard to say at this point, except that seeing some quite prominent commentators, not officially with the Israeli government, on social media in the last few hours, they seem to be 110% behind this, saying we tolerated Iran for too long, need to strike back. Of course, that machismo, frankly, is challenged if and when Iran strikes back and Israelis start dying on the streets of Tel Aviv or Jerusalem or Haifa or wherever it may be. And the idea of a tit-for-tat kind of war or escalation is petrifying, because right now it's hard to see who would stop that. I mean, the US often pours gasoline on these flames. The Trump administration, on the one hand, does seem to be interested in negotiation with Iran, but is also clearly sanctioning an Israeli attack on Iran. So we are in a deficit of global leadership, and it worries me that I don't really see many political forces anywhere being interested or able or willing to stop what seems to be yet more Israeli illegality across the region.
Antony, we know that since Trump took office again for the second time, he had really sought to pursue his America First agenda. Part of that was withdrawing US forces from combat zones, including, I guess, its influence in the Ukraine-Russia conflict. But you get the sense that perhaps with Israel it's different. And indeed, in the last few minutes, we're getting lines saying that Trump has said that it's waiting Iran's response and will defend Israel if necessary. Is Israel the exception here? Is Trump willing to engage more directly when it comes to defending Israel, when in other conflicts we've seen it was really looking to pull the US out of those wars?
I think Israel is always the exception. It's the ultimate exception, in fact, where you have a lot of America firsters in the US. There are some, look, the Republican Party and the MAGA movement is actually split to some extent. You have someone like a Tucker Carlson, who's obviously a far-right commentator now, very close to Trump, who's been saying for, frankly, years, but especially in the last few weeks, that any attack on Iran would be insane and disastrous, whereas you have other MAGA-type people who think that a war with Iran is necessary and fantastic. So it's a mixed picture. There's no one line. But ultimately, Trump has come in talking about, he was saying during the election last year that if Kamala Harris wins, there'll be chaos and war, but if I come in, there'll be peace. Well, that was always delusional, because A, the war in Ukraine continues. There's not much indication that Ukraine and Russia will come to any peace agreement anytime soon. And in relation to Israel and Gaza, there's talk obviously about negotiations to end this conflict. But here we are 6 months roughly after Trump took power, and the death toll, Israel is killing at least 100 Palestinians per day in Gaza. 100 per day. And I do not see much indication, at least right now, of that ending anytime soon. And ultimately, I think there is a shift going on within the American public, which is based on a recent Pew poll, which found that a majority of Americans now, Democrat and Republican, are opposed to Israeli actions. Now, that's not being reflected in government policy yet at the Trump administration level, or frankly in the Democratic Party. But there is a generational shift going on. And I see that in Europe, in the UK, Australia, and elsewhere. And at some point, not today, not tomorrow, but in years to come, that will be reflected in our politics, where Israel will not be able to get away with essentially carte blanche in the region. But right now, we're in a situation where not just Trump himself, but people around him, some of them, not all, as I said, but many of them are pro-Israel fanatics. And I saw when Israel launched these attacks a few hours ago, Lindsey Graham, who is, I'm going to be polite on air, but a pro-Israel fanatic, essentially saying, let's go. As in, this is someone like him who's dreamed for years, literally years, of attacks against Iran. And they're the kind of people who have the year of Trump as well. So we're in a very dark time, a very dark time.
Okay, Antony Loewenstein, we'll leave it there for now. Thank you, as always, for joining us on the program.
Thank you.